Okay, let's start a very important topic in Geology 204, the whole idea of how to tell geologic time and the fundamental principles that we use to do this. I say here that this PowerPoint is especially important, meaning two things. First of all, it makes a lot of test questions for you. You're going to be tested on it. Second of all, and more importantly for me and for the class, is that this is the basis of all that we do. And if you understand this, have a good understanding of this material, you'll do well in the rest of the course and grasp the material that way. You've seen this slide, the importance of sedimentary rock. I won't belabor this again, but remember that sedimentary rocks are the important ones for us that live on the surface of the earth. To do this time-telling process, there's a whole bunch of things we do, but I'm going to go through right at the beginning here 7 different concepts that I call the fundamental principles. You've got to know them. Secondly, I'm old school. I think it's important that you know what scientist first presented these or came up with the idea. This is going to rear itself on the exam as a matching question. Here's the names of the scientists, and here's a bunch of scientific accomplishments. Match the person with what they are known for. We start right away with one of the biggest, Steno. Although most people in the world don't really know him, he is such a giant in the sciences. And look at the dates. He was operating in the mid-1700s, and he is going to be the responsible person for the first 3 of these scientific principles I'm going to talk about. In class, I go over at great length the whole idea of his life and the arc of his life, but to suffice it to say here, besides doing geology, he also was a noted biologist, particularly anatomy, but also psychology, early psychologist, and then ultimately he became a priest and then a bishop in the Catholic Church. And he is the quintessential example or exemplar for what's called the Steno syndrome. And this is where scientists, or these geniuses that are uber scientists, at some point in their life, a switch is flicked and they do a 180 and they leave the scientific world and they go whole hog into matters of God, spirituality, things like that. This quote here is a lovely quote from him. There's beauty in that which we see, more beauty in that which we know, but most beautiful of all, that which we cannot comprehend. And that's the arc of his life. The what we see is science, then more beauty in what we know. That's when he started dabbling in thought processes and early psychology. And then the finish point, most beautiful of all, that which we cannot comprehend, which is God. There's the only other surviving portrait of him as an older man, and just to say here as a separate thing, he is now known as the Blessed Steno. He has been beatified by the Catholic Church, so he is just one small step away from being Saint Steno. Nobody else is that's sort of at the top of both charts, top of the science charts, top of the religious charts like Steno. Very important fellow. The next couple of slides are just a couple pictures of Florence, Italy, where he did most of his work, his important work, and where he is buried. Not buried, but he's entombed in the catacombs below this church here. And in class, I give a big, long spiel on going there and visiting, but we don't need to talk about that here. Let's get to his accomplishments. First of all, superposition. This is simply saying that if you see a stack of sedimentary rocks, and there's the beds, there's the layers, the oldest is at the bottom, the youngest is at the top. So in the slide here, the rocks by her boots are older than the rocks by her fingers where she's pointing at the top, and they get progressively younger as you go up the hill. And how that's interpreted is that, okay, rocks, sediments are laid down, and then the next sediment layers to be laid down, which are younger, they come afterwards, they are always laid on top. So it's a very simple logical thing, but Steno's the first to give us this. Second, original horizontality. This is saying that rocks are laid down flat, so that if you ever see rocks that are not flat, and look at the diagram here, you see flat rocks, but on the extreme right you see them tilted. The tilting had to come afterwards, so they must be laid down flat, and then if you see them any orientation not flat, that came afterwards. See, that's an example of relative age. I'm not saying what year or how many millions of years ago either one of those things happened. I'm just saying this is older than that. And think about that in your lives. You can say, well, I am older than my pet dog, or my car is older than me, if you have a really old beater, that kind of thing. And then the third principle that Steno is associated with, of the big seven, I guess, is lateral continuity. And this is his recognition that these flat sedimentary beds extend laterally, side to side, in all directions, but they don't go completely around the Earth. There's no onion skin layer that goes all the way around the Earth. Eventually, these rock layers thin to zero, or they just stop at the edge of a basin. So a sediment layer that's laid down in, say, Lake Michigan, it can only go from, say, the Wisconsin side of Lake Michigan over across the bottom to the Michigan side. Stops at that basin. Even more Steno. He is one of the founders of paleontology. So prior to Steno and some of the other polymaths of that era, people thought that fossils were tricks of the devil to lead us astray, or they had all kinds of weird things. The fossil shark teeth were called toothstones, and they supposedly fell out of the sky and knocked people out. And so those woodcuts at the bottom there are a couple of things, fossils coming from the heads of giant toads. They came up with all kinds of crazy ideas. But Steno was one of the interesting persons that looked at modern creatures and then looked at fossils and said, something once living must have lived here, died here, and now its parts are incorporated into the sediment. And the picture on the extreme right there is a woodcut from one of his early papers describing the anatomy of the head of a great white shark that was caught in Italy. And he looked at the stones, the fossils around Florence that had fossil shark teeth, and then looked at the shark teeth in the mouth of this creature and reasoned that, fossils were once living. Big, big, big achievement. Mary Anning. When I used to always give this presentation earlier, I trotted out all the people you're going to hear about in a minute here, and somebody said, well, aren't there any women? And here's the problem, that women, sadly, and persons of color, anybody except basically a white European male, was not only discouraged but actively barred from doing science in the 1600s, 1700s, 1800s. But Mary Anning is one of the exceptions, and so I kind of pull her out here. She's not really one of the fundamental principal persons, but she's certainly somebody that made some great accomplishments so that some of these other principles could be laid down. Now, she is famous in England for collecting and preparing, making beautiful preparations of fossils in the early 1800s. And there's a portrait of her and her dog. She has her geologic hammer, and she's along the cliffs in southern England, and she's found so many beautiful skeletons that are in museums all around the globe. She didn't always get credit for it, and so that quote there is sadly her worldview at the time, that she was treated unkindly and she was suspicious of everyone. Moving on, another great hero in geology, Charles Lyell. He is operating in the mid-1800s, and he's known for a bunch of things. He published the first textbook of geology. He was Charles Darwin's geology professor, and he is responsible for two of our fundamental principles of geology, the cross-cutting principle and the inclusions principle. Cross-cutting is simply stating that if you see sedimentary beds and other rock bodies, or look like they're shooting across them or cutting through them, or faults, if you see that the rock beds have broken and shifted, then those features, the rocks cutting through and the breaks, the faults, had to have come afterwards. What this is saying is that rocks had to exist in their little flat state before anything could break them or cut through them. So making these pictures bigger, in this picture right here, you see a lot of things going on. So first of all, you see the layering of the sedimentary rocks, but then follow the layering over to the right side of the slide, and you see that it completely folds over. It's like you took a sheet of paper and folded it over, or some clothes and folded it over. So those sedimentary rocks, they were flat, but something has drastically folded them over. And so we know that the rocks were laid down first, flat. Secondarily, they had to have been completely folded over, and then look by the wooden handle of that hammer, there's that other rock type. Now that's an igneous rock that has shot through it and cut through the whole thing. And so that is younger than all three. And you might go, well, wow, that's a complex rock picture, Rex, and you're describing, some interesting things happening, but this one's simple. Rocks can be really, really complex, and you can look at a rock wall like that someplace and might have to decipher 10, 20, even more events that happen in their relative order. The next picture is of sedimentary layers. You see them going across the screen, but one thing you see that's different is that there are breaks or cuts through the rock. And you can imagine if you took this central area and slid it upwards, that these white layers and the reddish brown layers would continue across. So the rock layers were laid down first, according to Steno. The oldest at the bottom, the youngest at the top. And then sometime afterwards, and so that's younger, the rock broke and did this sliding and motion. So this is this whole principle of cross-cutting. He's also responsible for number 5, inclusions. Now inclusions are saying that you need to spiral down and literally stick your face on the rocks and see that as you're laying down sedimentary beds, like these gray and red beds that I'm showing in this cartoon, as each bed gets laid on top of the other one, chunks of the old bed, clasts, get ripped up and incorporated into the bed above. Now, every bed does this, but they're only showing it for this one, and they've greatly enlarged it just so you can see it. So this red bed in the middle was deposited, and then sometime afterwards, this gray bed was deposited on. As it comes down, it rips up and includes chunks of these. So it automatically tells you, I'm looking at this, and this bed, the red one, is older than this bed. Now, if they're all still flat like this, you could say, well, I just use Steno's superposition principle, right? The oldest is at the bottom, the youngest is at the top. But rocks sometimes are completely turned upside down or standing vertical, or they can be in any orientation. And inclusions is a way of examining that and telling still this older, younger principle. Here's a picture, and if you're just looking at this, say you were looking at this from the side of the highway as you're driving by, you'd say, oh, there's a brown rock and it's touching a red rock. But if you go right up to it and look for inclusions, if you look at the one on the right here, inclusions of the red rock are included into the brown rock. So the red rock here is older than the brown rock. Contrast that with the other side, and here you see inclusions, chunks of the brown rock included into the red rock. So therefore, one, or the brown rock, has to be older here on the left side. So this is a key little thing for you. This is the end. I'm kind of split this into two parts. This is the end of part 1 for the geologic time lecture. Part 2, that's the next slide.